Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Welcome back to Out with Dan. Today, I'm excited to talk to Heather Levy about This Violent Heart. Welcome, Heather.
Oh, so great to be here.
Oh, thank you. What a wonderful read. It was so encaptured, it tied me up. I'm tongue tied. See how it is? It was like I'm tongue tied, which is rare. Will you give the audience an overview about what This Violent Heart is about?
Yeah. So it's about, it follows Devon Mays, a young therapist who reluctantly returns to her very conservative rural hometown after a tragic event occurs with one of her clients. And once she's back home, she discovers some unsettling truths surrounding her teenage best friend Summer's death, which may not have been by suicide as everyone had believed. She ends up reconnecting with her friend's twin brother, Keaton. You know where that's going. And they start digging into, what really happened. And all while she's grappling with her bisexuality, being back in this environment where she never felt safe to be out. So yeah, lots of layers, lots of things going on.
lots of things to definitely unpack, that's for sure. So one of the things I was struck about is conversations around things like suicide and death, especially when it comes to young people. I remember somewhere along the line when I was growing up, I heard someone say, well, don't say anything around her because, she's very sensitive. When someone ends their life or someone's life ends, especially with young people, kids need to talk about it, and mothers and fathers need to talk about it, and siblings need to talk about it. But yet I find in this culture we live in, we want to bury it under the rug or, in the garden or whatever. And that trauma is so intense that if we don't talk about it. So I love the fact that you've put Devon as a therapist. But I do want to ask, do you think empathy is always a help, or can it be a hindrance to someone? What do you think?
Well, it certainly is in the case for Devon. It's so much so that she just kind of takes on the responsibility and the guilt for things that she really shouldn't necessarily feel guilty about. But I mean, for myself personally, it's definitely been a hindrance in my life. You just have a tendency to get tied into other people's emotions and how they're doing, sometimes to the detriment of yourself. And that's been my experience. I've always been a very sensitive person to what's going on with people around me, which I also think makes me a better writer, because I am always paying attention. I was like the quiet kid. I was the weird kid.
I'm in camp with you.
I mean, weren't we all? But because of that, I was always listening. I was always, paying attention to what was going on. And sometimes I came across things that I had no control over. And that did cause a lot of issues. I've been a person who's always dealt with depression. Part of that dealt with my sexuality, and I'm sure we may dig into that. But I really wanted to show that throughout Devon's journey.
I think having empathy is a beautiful thing. I really do. So I don't want to take anything away from it. But I also know that for sensitive people, or for those of us who are people pleasers, or we try to fix the wing on a broken bird, empathy can weigh like a ton, because there's sometimes you can't do anything. And so
Right.
that was the thing, that was something that came to me in reading your book, was the fact that here's someone who's been through trauma of her own, picks a
Yeah.
profession that is going to keep her in other people's trauma. And I know a great deal of that is because if we have unresolved trauma that we don't really work out, it informs the rest of our lives, maybe not so healthy sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see that with Devon. Um, I think that she thinks that she processed trauma. And pretty clearly at the beginning of the book, something happens and she just spirals. It just took that one
Yeah.
thing for her to spiral, because I mean she hasn't. But she has this caring heart, this kind heart that really wants to help others. But she kind of gets herself in this position where she's not helping herself. She's never helped herself. She's never processed. So yeah, like the doctor that she works with, that she works under, tells her, you're not, you can't help anyone else unless you help yourself, basically. And so that's kind of part of her journey throughout the book, is seeing if she can even get to that point.
So let's unpack a little bit about religion. And I'm going to try really, really hard not to bash on religion. But so part of what happens in a restrictive religious household, at least mine was, I was never allowed to brag about anything that I had succeeded at, because that was looked down as being too full of yourself. Yet
Right.
if someone scored the best touchdown of the season, everybody bragged about that. But if I made straight A's, I was supposed to keep my mouth shut so I wouldn't hurt someone else's feelings. And so in this book, you brought in Devon's parents are what I would call strictly religious. And I find that the the framework that some religious people, including family members, want to put queer people in is always so unfair, and it causes us trauma that we may not deal with until much later on. So talk a little bit about how religion figures into Devon and maybe even Heather.
Yeah, I mean that in part was one of the reasons why I wrote this book. There are several reasons. One was my daughter, who is now an adult, which is crazy to think that she's an adult. She came out as bisexual a few years ago, and at that time, while I was, supporting her and just making sure that she knew that she was loved, in the back of my mind, I was like, wow, uh, this was something that I wish that I would have been able to come out to my parents, because I that's that question in my mind for the rest of my life, is I have no idea how they would have reacted. I know how I believed they would have reacted based on, just my growing up. We weren't particularly religious in my family, but it was very much like, you're a Christian and that's what you believe in. And I was not. So I was always the black sheep just from that alone.
An outsider once again.
Yeah, and I was this close. I was this close to coming out to my father had already passed that, and I was talking with my mom, and I had come out. I guess you could say come out as with my kink. Because I am part of the kink community. So I had written something. So I kind of came out in regards to that. And I so wanted to be like, oh, and by the way, I'm bisexual. Um, but I didn't. There was something that was just holding me back. And so I really felt, that seed was planted at that time for the story. And then as, these highly conservative, super religious politicians that we have in my state started coming down even more on the queer community, especially in the last few years. Just it seems like every other day there's a legislation proposed to limit rights. We can't have drag shows and
Right.
and places, and we took our kids to go to drag shows all the time. It was one of our favorite things to do. and I, so that kind of, the story just was forming over that time. And I knew that religion was going to play a part in the story, because it had to. That, it's unfortunate that in so many cases it's religion and those ideals that are prosecuting people within the queer community. So yeah, it was a natural thing that you know as far as the origin story for Devon, that of course she came from highly religious parents, like even more so than some of the people within her own community. There are a lot of people within a lot of those like small communities that are really kind of based on, okay, here's the church that you go to, and a lot of people, they go to the church for face value, right?
Yeah, absolutely,
And
because they don't want to be
yeah,
talked about.
yeah, but her parents were definitely, this is what we believe, and you don't deviate from that. So she really, within her own home, uh, really felt like she could not come out without being completely ostracized by her family, and she sees that happening within her community too. With certain characters, and so she's like, okay, well, obviously this is what's going to happen if I do come out.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that you touched on so poignantly and so directly, because I'm thinking about Jackie in this instance. Here's
Yeah.
a woman of Indian descent, and how people look at her differently just because, number one, her skin color first, and then it turns out that she's a lesbian, and so that comes in second. And I remember growing up, anytime that somebody in the little village I grew up in could find someone else that they could put down, they were so excited about it, because if there was a person of color, they were all obviously less than the white people. And it's something that we're not finished with in this country. I mean,
Not at all. Yeah.
it's sadly, in the last few years, we've seen much more of it than we had, say, 20 years ago. And it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And
That was, and with Jackie's character, it's also, there's another layer there too, with her being, proud of, like, she's not trying to hide her sexuality. Even as a teenager, she's a strong person. And even though she's been through a lot,
yes, yes.
and with racism, with homophobia, she's still very much, I'm here and I'm proud. And even though she's stuck in this community, that's a whole other layer, with her being from a different socioeconomical area in
Sure.
the community. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's a
So I'm going to, I'm going to tempt hell right now, because in reading this, there's some kink in the book, and there's some
yes.
dom and submissiveness in the book. And then this morning, my brain is not wired correctly, just so everybody that knows me knows it's slightly askew anyway. But I was thinking about religion and church, and how in a lot of ways that's a dom and sub type of environment as well, even though I don't think anyone from church would ever admit to that. But when you make women feel less than, you're putting them in a submissive or a subservient role. And this morning, as I'm letting my miswired brain go wild, I'm like, well, hell, that's just like the kink world I've seen sometimes.
That's definitely an interesting perspective. I agree. It is, that difference being that people within the kink community, obviously, because me being a part of it, and for myself personally, being on the submissive masochistic side of things, that it's an empowerment. And I wanted to show that. I definitely wanted to show that with Devon's character, especially in regards to sexual trauma. That's one of the things as an author I'm always interested in, that intersection of sexual trauma and reclaiming, a person's sexuality and finding empowerment, and including through kink. And kink is can be actually a really wonderful way to kind of flip that script, because the person who is submissive is the one who is directing everything. They have control over everything that is happening. Whereas, obviously in the religious culture, it's not like that at all.
No, right. And the religious culture, yeah. And I did want to make the distinction that there seems to be a hierarchy of roles, but obviously it's very different in the fact that in the kink situation, there's a lot of healthy mind building in that and soul building. Whereas
Right.
in religion, it's just the other. It's such a restriction. But and it's just, I don't know. So I'm going to quote something from your book that I found to be very, very deep. Society has a high tolerance for the suffering of women. That is a whole book in and of itself in one sentence, Heather. It
Yeah.
really struck a chord with me because I have been a feminist all of my life, and I'm very proud of that fact. No one got here without a mother being involved. No
Yeah.
one. And I'm like, how we put women down is just beyond my comprehension. Yet society seems to get off on the suffering of women and queers and people that are considered others. And
Yeah.
it really is mind blowing to me sometimes, and mind numbing maybe is a better word to put it.
Yeah. I'm so glad that connected with you, because yeah, that's a in many ways that is kind of the, if there's going to be like an over like, here's the sentence that represents the book.
Well, and I think in some ways that is it. I also want to share with the audience that in a lot of ways this is a love story in so many different levels. It from childhood, being a teenager into adulthood. It is truly a love story in so very many ways. I don't want it to seem like it's all depressing. There are a lot of depressing moments in the book, but ultimately, I think what you've crafted is a love story. It's almost, don't want to call it a romance. A love story is a better way to put it. It's not a romance, but it's a love story to humanity and to growing up different.
Yeah, that absolutely. And I've always straddled the line with I guess romance, and mystery, suspense. Every one of my novels has a love story of some sort. They're usually pretty messed up.
They're always. I think all love stories are messed up, Heather. I don't think there's a clean one.
All the good ones are, I think. Or I think that the ones where people have to go through fire to get to that point, and I feel like with this book, it's that love story with Devon's love for herself. That is the most important, whenever I was writing it. And I try not to get emotional about this because as I was writing it, and I'm working, obviously we work through all of our crap, whatever.
We get our therapy on the page. That's right.
We get our therapy on the page. And so it was very much like, wow, okay, yeah, like I'm still on that journey myself. So it's wonderful being a writer and being able to have your characters go through all these things and have some kind of conclusion, have some kind of ending. And because I'm still finding that myself. I'm still,
Absolutely.
I think it's a lot of that has to deal with having both of my parents pass and never having come out to them. There's always that, that question, but there's also coming out older in life too. There's always that question of what would my life have been if I would have been able to have that queer community at a younger age, because now being married to a man, there's kind of, it's very different, to be able to try to have more of that community. I'm still learning. I feel like I'm learning the queer ropes right now. Outside of like the people that were really close to, that I was really close with, who knew before I came out publicly. Yeah, it's a my husband and I are best friends, are a lesbian couple, and funny enough, they both were married to men before they found each other. We actually were with them as they came together as a couple. So we knew whenever they were with other people. And for the longest time, we were like, they're in love with each other. Like my husband would be like, they are in love with, what is going on here? And then they finally got together, and it was like, oh, this is beautiful. So they're kind of, like we're all, kind of okay.
Well, and I think that brings up such an important point, is we have to let each person write their things on their own blackboard and their own time. And we have to accept humans. It's so easy to look and say, well, Heather's married to a man and she has children, and it's different. So, but it's who Heather is. I need not define your life or describe your life. I should just wait for you to blossom and show me your life. That's the beauty of life to me. And I think that's something that happens with Devon as well, because by the end of the book, Devon has learned to give herself grace and forgiveness. And that is such a blessing to every human being, to be able to have grace and forgiveness, because there are things that some of us have. I've held on to some things my entire life that I've yet to really forgive myself about. And it's tiring after a while. But it's, I know it's part of who I am. But that's one of the things about the ending of your book that I love, the fact that I think Devon has found some grace and forgiveness. And of course, hope is something that weaves all through your narrative in this. So the reader is never overburdened. We're always hopeful that something good is going to come.
Yeah, that was really important. I'm so glad that you saw that. So yeah, and
I enjoyed it so much. I thought the chapters are short and my attention span is short sometimes. So that was fun. It moves at a very fast pace as well. So, we discover, and there's bounce back and forth. So I will ask you, because that's a bit about technique. So was it easy, hard? Did you have to plot a lot for the back and the forth between when they were teenagers and their adulthood? Or did that come easy for you?
I've always, with all the books that I've written, I've always somehow written in dual timelines. Sometimes in multiple POVs. I don't know why I can't get away from it. I'm actually, the book that I'm writing right now is the first time I'm writing a book in a linear timeline, and I'm like, oh, this is so hard. So for me, I just I have certain plot points that I am following. I am definitely a pantser, so it's very organic how I'm going back and forth, because I always want one chapter to inform the next chapter, so everything's just trying to flow as best as possible. Sometimes I do run into some issues and I'm like, oh, I got to go back and kind of
find where the knot is in the string.
Yeah, but I'm not, like, I know people who write one timeline, another timeline, and then they kind of shuffle things together, and I don't have a plan like that. I wish I did. I think it would make it so much easier if I could. I try. Wow. Of course, with publishers, they want to have like a whole synopsis. I'm like, I don't even know yet.
I'm not sure where they're at. So one of the things that I think for me as a reader, from the dual point of view, or two timelines, is it's as if you and I are having a conversation, and then it sparks something you thought that happened last week or last year, and you tell me a story about it, but we're right here in today's world. So that's one of the things about dual timelines. I know some readers are like, oh, that's not my favorite. I like it because I feel like it's a conversation. I think it's very to me, it's very relaxing, because sometimes in linear, I then become a little obsessed with making sure all the details are right. Because I told you my brain's wired crooked. So Heather,
Oh,
this
now
is
I'm even more nervous writing this next book. Like,
yeah, I'm gonna watch you. No, trust me,
am I
I'm
going to
not
have
that.
teachers
And
right?
if there was, I keep my mouth shut because I'm like, Dan, nobody wants to hear your opinion unless they ask for it. So, so again, the book is called This Violent Heart. It's by Heather Levy. Heather, this has been so much fun. Do you have a website or social media you would like to share?
Yeah, my website is heatherlevywriter.com, and people can also follow me on Instagram at Heather L. Levy, and then I'm at Heather Levy on Blue Sky. So
Perfect.
I'm trying to be out there now too on Blue
Right.
Sky.
Right. That too is exhausting sometimes.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me. This was a great deal of fun.
Thank you. I had a great time.
Yay! Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at outwithdan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at Go Out with Dan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.